In this news roundup of the week for 12th of April 2024, the European Court of Human Rights told Switzerland that it had to do more about climate change, which is either a triumph for common sense or a massive judicial overreach, depending who you ask. Arizona's ancient abortion law potentially throws a massive wildcard into the presidential election in one of the most influential potential swing states. And one of the US mainstream media pillars, NPR, is thrown into turmoil when a senior whistleblower highlights just how far the organisation has drifted off mission. In a remarkable and far-reaching ruling, the European Court of Human Rights this week ruled that Switzerland was not doing enough about climate change, and this, it suggested, was a human rights issue, because climate change violates the right to respect for one's private and family life. Now, this is a key connection because the simple truth is that the European Convention on Human Rights makes no mention of climate change whatsoever. There are proposals to amend that, but right now that is not the status quo. The case was brought by a group of older women with an average age of 73 who argued that they were particularly vulnerable to climate change in the form of heat waves. Such episodes can seriously affect their health, and they had a human right to expect that their government should do what it agreed to do, namely to take actions in line with its signing up to the Paris Climate Agreement. In ruling in the women's favour by a vote of 16-1, near unanimity, the court stated that Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights contains a right to protection by the state, quote, from the serious adverse effects of climate change on lives, health, well-being and quality of life. This significantly expands the legal concept of who could be considered a victim of climate harm. Unsurprisingly, campaigners were somewhat excited by the outcome, very much eyeing the potential for future cases across Europe. Ruth Delbert from the activist group Avaz said that the ruling served as, quote, a blueprint for how to successfully sue your own government over climate failures. Karina Herry, a researcher in human rights law and climate change, tweeted, "The court seems to have spelled out a clear way forward for climate cases and confirmed that climate change is very much an ECHR issue." Is it, though? Not everyone's so convinced. The dissenting judge, Tim Ike, wrote, "I fear that, in this judgment, the majority has gone beyond what is legitimate and permissible for this court to do, and, unfortunately, in doing so, may well have achieved exactly the opposite effect to what was intended." He said that the other judges were giving a false hope in what litigation and the courts could do about the problem. One place where the implications for the judgment hit particularly hard was with the current UK government. Its lawyer, Sudhanshu Swarup KC, told the court that it was turning the ECHR into a legislator, and it was de facto legislating for a global challenge despite not having global jurisdiction. The Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho mirrored that argument, saying that Strasbourg judges were taking over decisions that should be reserved for elected politicians. Numerous voices within the Conservative Party were raised against the judgment, saying that such overreach meant that Britain should now leave the ECHR. After all, they pointed out, soon it would be argued that spending more on the National Health Service was a human right, and limitless supply of housing, surely a human right, and just about every other area that somebody feels strongly about. This is apparently now the majority view amongst the party's committed voters, according to a poll this week for The Telegraph. It had already been a point of discussion after the court had blocked Rishi Sunak's policy of deporting illegal migrants to Rwanda. It remains to be seen if the opposition Labour Party, highly likely soon to be the next government, agrees with that, or indeed which other countries might come to the same conclusion, because they will all have court cases of their own in very short order, you would expect. And of course, arguing against the case while it was in progress, the Swiss government said that the link between its actions and any suffering by the elderly claimants was too tenuous and remote. Other opponents of the action have pointed to the fact that the trend has consistently been for Swiss women to overall live for longer, notwithstanding whatever heat waves they've experienced. But those arguments did not sway the court, in this case, for whatever reason. Now, the court didn't specifically say what Switzerland had to do to resolve the problem, but said instead that it should be looking at certain governance mechanisms, such as setting carbon budgets and interim targets, and then reporting on how those are being met. It's an open question whether the court will prove to be the one that started a momentum that spreads across similar institutions, or whether it will prove to have been an aberration and an example of overreach. The International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, all of them have similar types of cases currently in progress. And within days of this result, we had the first next case being filed, a UK homeowner, Kevin Jordan, who lost his home to coastal erosion, who is claiming that by allowing this to happen, the government violated his human rights. It's worth noting, if you're someone who believes that we're entering a new world order, probably dominated by China and moving away from the old rules-based system, one of the steps on the way is the discrediting of institutions that support that old system. Some have certainly argued that human rights judges, who think that it's a wedge device for pushing policy choices via the courts, it's exactly one of the ways how that degradation could take place, undermining trust in institutions. Now, those critics may be right, they may be wrong, but the stakes are arguably higher than the campaigners who tend to be very short-term focused on tactical wins might realise. That arguably goes as well for campaigners who are starting to propose the legal theory that fossil fuel companies could be charged with, quote, murder for their role in climate change. Not every bright idea someone has during a campaign brainstorm is going to work well in terms of the precedents that would get set. Now, meanwhile, in the US, another court case was threatening to have an outsized impact on the progress of democratic systems, specifically the Arizona Supreme Court ruling that the state can enforce its 160-year-old near-complete ban on abortion. This may well turn out to be a relatively short-lived ruling, since it will likely be put to voters in a ballot measure at the November election. But with Arizona, one of the key election states for 2024, the shining of a spotlight on this particular issue in this particular way certainly was considered to be less than helpful by the GOP and specifically Donald Trump. Trump was left trying to neutralize the issue, which the Democrats were expected to put front and centre of their campaign over the coming months. In so doing, he was trying to walk a middle ground between the hopes and expectations of some of his base that want him to back a 15-week federal limit, and the views of centre voters who are open to persuasion that he would be better to vote for than Joe Biden. So he made a statement saying that the issue was one for the states, a situation that was now possible thanks to the actions of the judges that he put onto the Supreme Court, etc., etc., but that he believed that the Arizona law specifically goes too far, and he predicted that it would be rectified. He had also said previously that Florida's 6-week abortion ban was, quote, a terrible mistake. In making this comment, he was deeply disappointing the anti-abortion activists who had been pinning their hopes on him championing their cause. But his calculation there would be the usual one, once a political contest moves from the primaries to the main general election. Where else are the base going to go? They're not going to vote for Joe Biden. But his campaign is clearly now targeting the centre ground, where the support for Biden is soft and where Trump needs to get the most support he can in a contest where the margins will be wafer thin. So he wants the focus to be on his attack issues: immigration, the state of the economy. Naturally, the Democrats are pretty desperate not to let his deflection succeed. So the Biden campaign put out a digital ad focusing on a Texas woman who nearly died after doctors refused to perform an abortion. The message, focusing on the overturning of Roe v. Wade, was "Trump did this." And that's something you can expect to hear over and over again in the states that will hold the most sway over the end result. In the meantime, the Biden administration is scrambling to try to get as much as what it has passed in the last couple of years out the door while they still can. It's an indication of the lack of confidence amongst many officials that, according to reports, the administration is trying to ramp up the speed with which funding for next-generation energy projects gets out the door. Congress had approved $200 billion for such projects, but with bureaucracy being what it is, only around $25 billion has actually been spent to date. The Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office has received 203 active applications, seeking a total of $262 billion in loans. But if you can hand out such huge wadges of cash in haste, you would be wide open to accusations of waste or scandal, and let's face it, it's not as though no one's paying close attention. Democratic Senator Martin Heinrich said that the loan program is, quote, "one of the most important tools we have to be competitive with an aspirational China," which is throwing investment and subsidy into its clean energy technologies, along with products such as electric vehicles. Of course, that's exactly the concern of some observers, that large amounts of money spent in a hurry will end up finding its way precisely to some of those Chinese operations. Republicans have also criticised some specific lending decisions, such as a $3 billion partial loan guarantee intended to offer solar power and battery storage to disadvantaged communities specifically. Heinrich said if Trump should be re-elected in November, the loans program would just die on the vine. Meanwhile, another pillar of the US establishment came under attack this week after a senior business editor at NPR wrote a piece for Barry Weiss's Free Press website, whistleblowing on what he'd seen of aberrant liberal bias in the way that NPR covered recent events. Uri Berliner wrote the piece, "I've been at NPR for 25 years, here's how we lost America's trust." And he did so without informing his employers in advance, and it caused a firestorm. In the piece, he says that during Donald Trump's term in the White House, NPR veered from its standard approach towards efforts to damage or topple Trump's presidency. NPR news reports turned to Adam Schiff over and over again to amplify allegations of Russian collusion. But when the Mueller report found no evidence to support it, NPR had very little to say about that. According to Berliner, the organisation simply moved on, with no mea culpas, no self-reflection. The same applied to the Hunter Biden laptop story. Along with most of the mainstream media at the time, NPR just turned a blind eye to it. NPR's public position had been, we don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories. But Berliner said this, during a meeting with colleagues, I listened as one of NPR's best and most fair-minded journalists said it was good we weren't following the laptop story because it could help Trump. And then there was the lab leak theory in the pandemic. And again, NPR was quick to dismiss the idea as a conspiracy theory and even declare that the idea of a lab leak had been debunked by scientists. As late as February 28, 2023, NPR was asserting confidently that the scientific evidence overwhelmingly points to a natural origin for the virus. Now, in the light of this expose, NPR publicly apologised and said it had learned hard lessons and would try to do better. I'm kidding! The organisation, although it hasn't so far fired Mr. Berliner, nevertheless pushed back hard against what he'd written. Edith Chapin, the NPR editor-in-chief, sent an email to staff saying, "We are proud to stand behind the exceptional work that our desks and shows do to cover a wide range of challenging stories." Chapin is said to have told an internal meeting she didn't want Berliner to become a martyr. Tony Kavin, NPR's managing editor of Standards and Practices, said that he rejected Berliner's claims, adding that the piece would make his journalist jobs harder. The next time one of our people calls up a Republican congressman or something and tries to get an answer from them, they may well say, "Oh, I read these stories, you guys aren't fair, so I'm not going to talk to you." Because, obviously, Republican congressmen had no critical words to say about the mainstream media before this particular piece was published. Of course, it didn't take long before presidential candidate Trump added his voice, calling for NPR to no longer be publicly funded. NPR says that it receives under 1% of its $300 million budget from public funds, plus fees from other federally backed partner stations. This channel, of course, gets no public money, which is good. Wouldn't want that. And this channel also did, in fact, you may recall, cover with an open mind the possibility of a lab leak numerous times, the Hunter Biden laptop story, and a number of others that Berliner didn't even mention. I am only able to do any of that thanks to the support of people via patreon.com/Mallen Baker. If you would like to add your support, please head on over to that site. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.